This is a story about Russia. About Lenin and Stalin. And the dilution of their ideals. Lenin would die on the 21st of January, 1924. Stalin, having seen his chance, would consolidate power and take reins of the Soviet machine. Soon, Russia would be drawn into a war with the forces of Western Europe, unified under a similarly totalitarian dictator. As the war escalated, a coalition of forces from Canada, America, and the British Empire would aid the Soviet defense, creating multiple fronts and overwhelming the Germans with superior technology, forces, and planning. Russia, though, would emerge as the victor, having again defeated an invading force from Europe bent on continental domination. But it was the Americans, fashioning themselves as champions, who would exert the most force, and in a frightening display of power and science, utilizing the dark reaches of technology, unleash an atomic blast onto the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, crushing Japan and sending a message to Russia, whose encroachment in the Far East was worrying to the newly arrived superpower. Prior to the US bombing of Japan, which had occurred 4 months after Roosevelt's death, a meeting of the Big Three was held in Yalta, Crimea. America and the USSR had now arrived as the sole leaders of the world, and Churchill and his defeated British Empire ushered them forward, together in peace, to a new age. This peace was tenuous at best, and each occupied their own hemisphere of the earth, exerting influence over their constituent countries. From 1917 to the end of the war, the Soviet Union would grow in size. From Moscow it was able to effectively govern and control a union of semi-independent republics. The Soviet Union, having found itself in a new dawn, had begun, under Stalin, a series of forced modernization, industrialization, and militarization, creating an army that would become the marvel of the world, and guarantee its sovereignty from the ever-prospering American Empire. This friction would pit the East against the West, and thus the second half of the 20th century would be characterized by a Cold War between each empire.
United with Russia in war, we strove to preserve that unity and peace. We helped organize the United Nations, in which the nations of the world have mutually pledged to cooperate in fostering world peace and progress. Andrei Gromyko signed for Russia. But in the first post-war Italian elections, the communists created disorder in an attempt to gain control of the government. Once more, the world was reminded that basic in the idea of communism is the plan of world revolution, and that Russian communism has stepped beyond that plan to achieve world domination through aggression. And with the most deadly of all weapons available to the Russians, no peoples in the world can feel secure against this aggression.
Stalin would die on March 5, 1953. the bedridden tyrant would suffer a stroke at the age of 74. He had three likely successors. The first, Georgy Malenkov, would be forced to resign in 1955 for the abuse of power. The second, Lavrent Beria, was arrested and executed on December 23, 1953, leaving only Nikita Khrushchev, who quickly emerged as the sole leader of the Soviet Union.
February the 25th, 1956 was a watershed in the history of communism. It was the day Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin in front of the 20th Party Congress. His speech was emotional and explicit, and it caused a worldwide sensation. Stalin was condemned as a brutal, despotic, criminal murderer. The idol was destroyed at a stroke. But there was more to Khrushchev's denunciation than met the eye.
During the secret speech, Khrushchev was heckled by an audience member, wondering why he hadn't said this before, when Stalin was still in power, so that such tragedy could have been avoided. Khrushchev shouted back into the audience, demanding that whoever asked the question identify themselves. When no one spoke up again to identify who had asked the question, Khrushchev responded by saying, "See, we were afraid, just like you." This period became known as the Khrushchev Thaw, and it saw an improvement in Soviet relations with the West, despite a potentially volatile Cuban Missile Crisis, limited political reform, and an unrealized agricultural plan. But, perhaps more importantly, it allowed a liberalization of the arts. It was during this thaw that the Russian writer, Victor Pelevin, was born. In Moscow, the day of November 22, 1962. Both of his parents were teachers, and the young Pelevin showed an aptitude for the literary arts. Though Khrushchev reigned over a large empire, his reforms fell flat, and in October 1964 he voluntarily resigned at the behest of the Soviet Presidium. Soon Leonid Brezhnev would occupy the position of General Secretary, and the Soviet Union would return to its past failures.
The Politburo selected Leonid Brezhnev to lead the attack on Khrushchev. In October 1964, Khrushchev was deposed.
I met him. He gave me his briefcase, and he never touched it again. He said, "It's all finished. I resign." When they all went into lunch, I left. I didn't want to join them. I don't think they actually invited him to have lunch anyway. He was in a state of nervous stress. He had tears in his eyes. He was very unsettled. He couldn't find a place for himself. He would go to the dacha, come back, sit around. It was a month and a half before he gradually calmed down.
Few people missed Khrushchev. Many wanted a firm hand on the tiller again. Stability was restored in the Soviet Union, but unrest stirred in the empire.
They tried to push back the progress of freedom, but they didn't succeed anymore. We made 2 steps forward, and we were repressed by 1 step, but we gained 1 step always.
Suddenly the papers were full of truth, revealing the crimes of Stalinist Czechoslovakia. After 2 decades of terror and silence, Czechs and Slovaks had found their voice again.
People came in thousands, and if they didn't get in, they listened outside for hours on end. People suddenly realized that they can live more freely, and they came very anxious to learn about the new enlarged boundaries of their lives.
Na jedné straně On the one hand, they wanted to preserve communism and socialism, as they called it. But on the other hand, they wanted to give it a human face, which meant that they wanted to lift the lid a little. But they hoped that the lid would not fly off with the pressure inside the cooker, as it were, that they would still be able to contain the situation.
Well, it was funny that, you know, before, you know, in the 50s and like that, you know, people were looking over their shoulders, you know, who could be following you. And if they had some, you know, somebody brought from West some newspaper, it was in the pockets, deep in the pockets. In the 60s, in the euphoria of free press, everybody was talking freely and at the same time looking over their shoulders. Because it was not, it was, I think it was a freedom in spasmodic freedom, that people were really, it was like a freedom unleashed by fever, you know. It was not really a comfortable freedom. It was not.
Though Brezhnev would denounce Khrushchev's liberalization, his 18-year reign as leader of the Soviet Union, the second longest behind Stalin, would see a marked improvement of Russia's relations with the West. During Brezhnev's tenure, the Soviet Union would experience economic stagnation. It was then that the first cracks in the Soviet machine, perhaps spurred into impetus by Khrushchev's thaw, would make themselves known, and under Brezhnev Russia would, in hopes of a small improvement for the country, create a strange alliance between the Soviet Union and the Pepsi Cola Company. In 1972, PepsiCo struck a barter agreement with the then government of the Soviet Union, in which PepsiCo was granted exportation and Western marketing rights to Stolichnaya vodka in exchange for importation and Soviet marketing of Pepsi Cola. This exchange led to Pepsi Cola being the first foreign product sanctioned for sale in the USSR. Victor Pelevin, 10 years old at the time, would have enjoyed his first taste of American consumerist manufacturing. The youth at this time, having lived through the end of Khrushchev and on through the Brezhnev era, would come to be known as Generation P. They were the beginning of a modern generation of Russians, raised on Pepsi and witness to economic stagnation and the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and the 9-year war that followed. This war, known as the Soviet-Afghan War, would be fought in support for the, at that time, emergent communist government in Afghanistan. It would later be deemed a failure, with Russia's role being identified as something akin to America's involvement in Vietnam. The Islamic extremist forces opposing the Soviets would receive aid and training from Pakistan and China, who had earlier been an important ally in the Soviet Empire's direct sphere of influence. The anti-Soviet forces, though, would perhaps best be remembered for their heavy reliance on American funding and support, and as a result the early creation of a group of Islamic extremists under Osama bin Laden, later having become known as Al-Qaeda, which would, as foreign interveners, oppose the atheist communists. Meanwhile, Brezhnev, still head of the Soviet Union, saw his health deteriorating due to an addiction to sleeping pills, heavy alcohol and tobacco use, and rapid weight gain. He would not live to see the end of the war. Meanwhile, in 1979, Victor Pelevin would graduate from an elite Moscow high school with a special English program. A gifted student, he would then go on to attend the Moscow Power Engineering Institute. Meanwhile, back in the corridors of power, a young intellectual named Mikhail Gorbachev was rising through the ranks, becoming a member of the Politburo, the highest authority in the country. Leonid Brezhnev, his health further deteriorated, made his last public appearance on November 7, 1982, the 65th anniversary of the 1917 revolution, as he stood on Lenin's mausoleum, gazing out at the crowds. He would die 3 days later of a heart attack, at age 75. Brezhnev would be followed in office by Yuri Andropov, who, 5 months later, would die at the age of 69. The office of General Secretary, at that point jokingly labeled as the executive branch of a geriatocracy, then passed to Konstantin Chernenko, who died 13 months later, at age 73. Then, in 1985, the comparatively youthful Mikhail Gorbachev would ascend to the office of General Secretary at the age of 54.
The state of the Soviet Union and its society could be described very simply with a phrase used by people across the country. We can't go on living like this any longer. That applied to everything. The economy was stagnating, there were shortages, and the quality of goods was very poor.
Gorbachev took over a superpower sick with social breakdown, corruption in the Communist Party, and alcoholism. To tackle these ills and to revive a decrepit economy, Gorbachev called for reconstruction, or perestroika, and a new spirit of honesty, glasnost.
I remember very clearly what Gorbachev said at that time. He said, there are two roads we can take. We can either tighten our belts, very, very tightly, and reduce consumption, which the people will no longer tolerate. Or we can try to diffuse international tension and overcome the disagreement between East and West, and so free up the gigantic sums that are spent on armaments in the Soviet Union.
In the United States, another leader was enjoying his second term in office. His response to the apparent decline of his country's supposed enemy would be far from subtle, and he would quickly reaffirm their rival status.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan.
Thank you. Pray they will discover the joy of knowing God. But until they do, let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world. I don't know whether you know it or not, but I have a new hobby. I am collecting stories that I can actually prove are told among the Russian people. They make them up themselves, they tell them between themselves, reveals they got a great sense of humor, and they've also got a little cynical attitude about things in their country. And one of these stories, the one I'm going to tell you, I told to General Secretary Gorbachev, and he laughed. The story was an American and a Russian arguing about their two countries, and the American said, look, in my country, I can walk into the Oval Office, I can pound the president's desk and say, Mr. President, I don't like the way you're running our country. And the Russian said, I can do that. The American said, you can? He says, yes. I can go into the Kremlin, to the General Secretary's office, pound his desk and say, Mr. General Secretary, I don't like the way President Reagan's running his country. You know, less than one family out of 7 in the Soviet Union owns an automobile. Most of the automobiles are driven by the bureaucrats. The government furnishes them and drivers and so forth. So an order went out one day to the police that anyone caught speeding, anyone, no matter who, gets a ticket. Well, Gorbachev came out of his country home, his dacha. He was late getting to the Kremlin. There was his limousine and driver waiting. He told the driver to get in the back seat, he'd drive it. Down the road he went. They passed two motorcycle cops. One took out after him. And pretty soon he's back with his buddy. And his buddy says, well, did you give him a ticket? And he said, no. Well, he said, why not? Oh, he said, too important. Well, he said, we're told to give anybody a ticket, no matter who it is. Oh, he said, no, this one was too, I could. Well, he said, who was it? He said, I couldn't recognize him. But his driver was Gorbachev.
Reykjavik, Iceland, the second Reagan-Gorbachev summit. Gorbachev now decided to re-examine Reagan's first ever arms control proposal, known as the zero option. Reagan had offered not to deploy cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe if the Soviets withdrew their SS-20 rockets. Brezhnev had turned Reagan down flat. Now Gorbachev wanted to cut a deal.
He understood that perestroika and the internal changes were starting to slow down, that he had little time on his hands. He had to decide. Either he could free up resources from the arms race, or he'd be forced to look for them elsewhere. I was with him when he decided to confront Reagan with the question, did he or didn't he want an agreement? Did he or didn't he want disarmament?
Ronald Reagan did want disarmament, but would he give up his Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI?
I said, okay, let's not even leave 100 missiles. Let's abolish them completely and go for the zero option. This came as a shock. Everyone was surprised.
Reagan hit the table and said, well, why didn't you say so in the first place? That's exactly what I want to do. And if you want to do away with all weapons, I'll agree to do away with all weapons. All weapons, of course we'll do away with all weapons. Good. That's great. Now we have an agreement, yes. But you must confine SDI to the laboratory. No, I won't, said Reagan. No way. SDI continues. I told you that. I am never going to give up SDI.
I think that my principal position was and remains the same. The nuclear arms race should never be taken into space. It was difficult enough to limit the nuclear arms race on Earth.
Gorbachev pressed and pressed, and at one moment, President Reagan, who was very clear in his mind about this, wrote a little note and pushed it over at me. It said, George, am I right? I read this note. I said, absolutely, and passed it back.
The chance to make the most momentous agreement since the Cold War began, the elimination by the United States and the Soviet Union of all but 100 nuclear weapons each, was lost.
During this time, Victor Pelevin was attending graduate school at the Moscow Power Engineering Institute, serving in the Air Force and working as an engineer for MPEI's Department of Electrical Transport. Then, on the 26th of April, 1986, at precisely 1:23 Moscow time, one of the reactors in the Chernobyl power plant in Ukraine, number 4, had a sharp increase in power which caused an explosion of one of its cores. From this explosion, a large displacement of radioactive fuel and core materials were loosened onto the environment, causing severe damage to the natural landscape and its surrounding atmosphere. This catastrophe would reveal the hollowness inherent in Gorbachev's glasnost policies, as the Soviet Union would initially attempt to cover up the disaster, contradicting one of their leader's newly minted tenets. 31 people died in the accident itself, and countless others were afflicted with cancer and a range of side effects owing to the radiation. In all, the disaster and its cleanup was estimated to have costed roughly 18 billion rubles, and required a force of some 500,000 workers to fully contain. Gorbachev's reforms were beginning to fall flat, and his Soviet empire endured yet more economic and cultural stagnation. His country's Western rival, on the other hand, seemed poised at the top, alone among the superpowers of the world due to its current economic stability. Despite displaying such clear levels of superiority, America would retain a relatively positive relationship with Gorbachev's dying sovereignty. Now a decaying republic that had become saturated with foreign influence, led into the Eastern Bloc by way of Pepsi's Trojan horse.
Media, the fax machine, the computer, were opening up the USSR. Gorbachev and the Politburo watched satellite TV in their offices. After Olympic boycotts, the 1986 Goodwill Games were seen live both sides of the Iron Curtain. Gorbachev's policy of glasnost brought pop culture out into the open.
A new breed of young people was created by our intellectuals, a breed that rejected all our Soviet past. This was moral degradation. Our youth was being turned into human robots.
The Soviet people were being plunged into wrenching change.
We became particularly worried by the end of 1987. We saw that the country was not going in the direction it should. The situation of the people was getting worse and worse. The situation of the armed forces was no better.
Gorbachev reacted to growing opposition by pressing ahead with plans to reform the Communist Party.
И все-таки все то, что мы развернули через реформу, через демократию вот эту, через советы, через трудовые коллективы, через вот эти вещи все, включения, вот это только путь. К этому надо. Там уже вы, власть в натуре будете держать.
The main achievement of Gorbachev's policies was that in the space of a year or two, he made the fear disappear, as if by magic. People had lost their fear of speaking and acting freely.
If I hadn't promoted the reforms, if I hadn't tried to let the people breathe freely, if I hadn't tried to open the door to glasnost and democracy, to stir the society, to get it thinking and acting, I would probably still be in my Secretary General's armchair today. I could have stayed there a lot longer, since I'm still quite young.
Washington, D.C. Ronald Reagan still pursued his Star Wars vision. The Kremlin now believed that it would never happen, and therefore should not delay agreement on arms reduction. Gorbachev, in the United States for the first time, had come to sign an historic treaty. His visit, seen live on Soviet TV, enhanced his standing at home and abroad. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed a far-reaching agreement. For the first time, an entire category of nuclear weapons was to be abolished.
Mikhail Gorbachev would become a symbol for the renascent global world which was emerging, even being lauded with the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990, but under his rule, the USSR continued to stagnate, and collapse from an overextended bureaucracy, a nearly non-existent culture, and the trappings of their stale military rhetoric. Things eagerly poked fun at by the West.
That I heard was about the man walking along the street at night, Moscow, Soviet soldier called to him to halt. He started to run. The soldier shot him. And another man said, "Why did you do that?" Well, he said, "Curfew." Well, he said, "It isn't curfew yet." He said, "I know. He's a friend of mine. I know where he lives. He couldn't have made it." I heard one about a fellow who went to the KGB to report that he lost his parrot. The KGB asked him why he was bothering them. Why didn't he just report it to the local police? Well, he answered, "I just want you to know that I don't agree with a thing my parrot has to say." Which makes me think of a story. Everything makes me think of a story. About 3 dogs, an American dog and a Polish dog and a Russian dog. They were all having a visit, and the American dog was telling them about how things were in this country. He said, "You know, you bark and you bark long enough, and then somebody comes along and gives you some meat." And the Polish dog said, "What's meat?" The Russian dog says, "What's bark?" I didn't tell this one to Gorbachev. You know, there's a 10-year delay in the Soviet Union of delivery of an automobile. And only 1 out of 7 families in the Soviet Union own automobiles. There's a 10-year wait. And you go through quite a process when you're ready to buy, and then you put up the money in advance. And this happened to a fella, and this is their story that they tell, this joke. That this man, he laid down his money, and then the fella that was in charge said to him, "Okay, come back in 10 years and get your car." And he said, "Morning or afternoon?" And the fellow behind the counter said, "Well, 10 years from now, what difference does it make?" And he said, "Well, the plumber's coming in the morning."
Despite the apparent greatness of his air-proclaimed vision, Gorbachev's USSR was in shambles. No longer able or willing to maintain a firm grip over its constituents, many of the republics on its western borders pined for release. Reagan, who was very much a product of the boisterous and wide-sweeping conservative movement of the 70s, which had been brought into Western focus by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, would soon deliver the last American attack on the Soviet Union. On June 12, 1987, Berlin's 750th anniversary, Reagan stood before Brandenburg Gate below the Berlin Wall, and flexed his American strength one last time.
We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The wall had stood for over 25 years, a barrier not just between East and West Berlin, but of East and West Europe. Eventually, Gorbachev would be forced to give in, partially due to an exodus of East Germans through places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia, as well as a fervent level of protest. Finally, on the evening of November 9, 1989, the wall began its symbolic fall, as personnel chipped away at its foundations all across the city.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Reporting tonight from Berlin.
From the Berlin Wall specifically, take a look at them. They've been there since last night. They are here in the thousands. They are here in the tens of thousands. Occasionally they shout, Die Mauer muss weg, the wall must go. Thousands and thousands of West Germans come to make the point that the wall has suddenly become irrelevant. Something, as you can see, almost to party on. How do you measure such an astonishing moment in history? The East German government said tonight they were going to make more openings in the wall, at least a dozen more. Put bulldozers right through the wall so that more people could cross to the west. The East German communist leadership tonight said there'd be a new election law guaranteeing secret elections which the rest of the world could monitor. And only 24 hours after East Germans were told they could go anywhere, anytime, the Soviet Union said that was a sensible move. Thousands of East Germans came across the border today, perhaps more than 100,000, so many that border police lost count. And at every border crossing, thousands of West Germans there to say welcome. Some of the really good news today was for the East German government. While thousands and thousands came to look, even gape at this showcase of capitalism, the vast majority said they would be going back. The simple act of giving people the freedom to travel may have convinced East Germans they need not take flight whenever the door opens just a fraction. It has been an astonishing day. Hour after hour, all through today, thousands and thousands of West Germans have come to the wall to see for themselves, to climb up on this hideous structure, to finally look down at what has been no man's land for so long. Finally, after all these years, to say in person what they think of the East German border guards. Or try to make friends. Suddenly, a flashback to what it was like for so long. A young man in the East makes a dash for the wall. They catch him and take him away. Presumably, he should have used a legal border crossing. Only a couple of years ago, he might have been shot. Not today. Today, it was possible to have a dialogue. Your government seems to be changing every day. Where do you think it's going? That's the government's problem, he says, not mine. Such an astonishing moment in history. Now, what's it feel like to be standing on top of the wall?
It's incredible for me. It's I can't describe really my feelings. It's something unreal for me.
If there is someone who sleeps for 8 weeks and you told him what happened here, he thinks you're crazy. It's unthinkable.
Unthinkable. Tonight at the border crossings, including Checkpoint Charlie, which is normally a crossing for non-Germans only, there was still a block-long gauntlet of goodwill. Here, as everywhere else, it is one breathtaking moment after another. The new arrivals in their tiny, smoke-belching cars were greeted like athletes, patted on the back and cheered forward, sometimes pushed forward. Many of the East Germans were stunned by it all. I've been waiting 28 years for this, he told us. Will you come permanently, we asked. How long will you stay? I haven't much money, he said, but I'll stay till I run out of gas.
The Soviet Union was in a near free fall. This pressure, from outside, had been building up for years along the Soviet foundations, springing leaks into the metaphorical Russian dam. Leaks which Gorbachev attempted to plug, using his glasnost, perestroika, and nuclear arms agreements with the US, but these leaks were too much and too many, and the dam could no longer hold firm. Russia and its unstable union were now desperate, and were reluctant to grovel to their Western rivals, despite their recent understanding. Thus is the predicament of such precarious power. Soon its republics began to disband, and the Soviet Union found itself losing Azerbaijan, Georgia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Then, a very strange thing indeed did happen, all to be covered by the Western media.
Good evening. The stunning overthrow of Mikhail Gorbachev by communist hardliners dominates the news this Monday. Gorbachev was reported under house arrest as Soviet tanks took up positions throughout Moscow.
That was how Robert McNeil described the shocking developments of August 19, 1991 on the McNeil Air NewsHour, a coup that would backfire and lead to the end of the Soviet Union.
There were scenes of desperation in Moscow.
A report from Robert Moore of Independent Television News showed the chaos on the ground.
The Red Army tanks had rolled into the heart of the city, and not even heroic gestures could stop them. Workers and shoppers quickly surrounded the security forces. The man who has taken over is Vice President Gennady Yernayev, whose reputation as a hardliner is matched only by his image as a grey man who would serve loyally.
Then came a description of what would become the most iconic image of the day.
Early in the day, Russian President Boris Yeltsin called on the Soviet people to challenge the coup leaders. The one-time Gorbachev rival made the appeal on top of a tank near the Russian Parliament building.
Judy Woodruff reported on the swift U.S. reaction.
President Bush issued a statement tonight condemning what he called an unconstitutional resort to force.
It seems clear all the time that contrary to official statements out of Moscow, that this move was extra-constitutional, outside of the constitutional provisions for governmental change.
Then NewsHour correspondent Roger Mudd identified the men behind the coup who were strangers to most Americans.
Instead of the single charismatic Gorbachev the world had become accustomed to over the past 6 years, it was once again 8 men in gray suits who held the power. It was the first appearance of the State Committee for the State of Emergency, and it included the head of the KGB, the Defense Minister, the Interior Minister, and the police.
To do nothing at this crucial period means to take grave responsibility for tragic and very unpredictable circumstances.
When Yernayev was finished, the very first question, of course, was, where is Mikhail Gorbachev? Yernayev's answer drew derisive laughter from the press.
Let me say that Mikhail Gorbachev is now on vacation. He is very tired after these many years, and he will need some time to get better.
Next, Russia watchers weighed in a panel discussion.
They acted strongly against the rights of national republics. This commission is illegal. Those leaders absolutely criminal people.
My concern is that while acting in the name of law and order, they may trigger a civil war.
2 former KGB officers predicted the coup would not succeed.
I do believe that within a few months, probably within a year, all of them will be gone. The problem, however, is that they can cause great civil unrest and maybe civil war in the Soviet Union, and before they will be kicked out of power.
I've seen quite a few KGB orchestrated coups while being in the center, and I must say that this is a very, very unusual coup.
One of our commentators that day was Madeleine Albright, who would become Secretary of State 6 years later.
I think that the coup will not last. I think the issue here is that the Soviet Union is unraveling. What we're seeing are very deep splits within the public. They are unclear about what direction to go in. They treasure their democratization and glasnost.
She was right. In the next 2 days, protesters rallied against the coup, which quickly fell apart. By the end of the week, Gorbachev had returned to Moscow and to power. The Communist Party was disbanded, and by the end of the year, the Soviet Union itself had been dismantled.
Yeltsin, originally a member of the Politburo until a possibly politically motivated resignation in 1987, had initially supported Gorbachev, whose supposed grand visions pleased the West, but were in need of much support at home. Where such rejection meant his plunge was fast approaching. And indeed Gorbachev did fall, and Yeltsin was there to ascend the mantle.
the act that spelled the end of communism and Russia's worst crisis since the revolution. How will Boris Yeltsin be remembered?
From a hero of democracy, raising his fist to see off an attempted coup, to embarrassing stumbles, Yeltsin was always a flamboyant leader. He ruled Russia from 1991 till 1999, overseeing the death of the Soviet Union and the birth of a democratic Russia. His legacy will be debated for years to come. But in the area of the economy, Yeltsin pushed for market reform and ending price fixing, driving inflation up by 2,000% until the government rebelled. The crisis culminated in Yeltsin dissolving the parliament. MPs then responded by refusing to leave the building. For the second time in his career, the deadlock was broken by tanks. They pounded the building until the leaders of the attempted coup were arrested. It wasn't the last time Yeltsin resorted to violence. In Chechnya, Yeltsin's attempts to put down a rebellion cemented this region as a flashpoint for conflict that continues today. Yeltsin accepted democracy, but still manipulated it to remain in power, relying on his family and multimillionaire businessmen to call the shots in the new Russia.
Yeltsin's tenure, most famous domestically as a failure, almost reached as broad an appeal as Gorbachev's had, but it would be remembered often for its introduction to the world of a young upstart intelligence officer turned politician, Vladimir Putin, who, as a relative unknown, would become prime minister under Yeltsin in 1999.
But in retirement, the exhibitionist leader virtually disappeared from public view.
Under Yeltsin, the Soviet Union had been transformed into a Russian Federation, one which, despite heavy inflation and a severely low GDP, embraced major facets of Western capitalism, opening up commerce, allowing corporate partnerships, trading in stocks and exchanges, and surrendering to the enterprises of America. Though there was much wealth to be made for a select few, to many Russians it seemed as if their forefathers' vision had been shattered. Especially during the market crises of 92 and 98, when Russia's uneven advent of a free market would seem as if this transition had compromised their nation.
Vladimir Putin strode into town.
Почему раньше здесь не было людей, которые способны были принимать решения? Почему здесь-то забегали все как тараканы перед самым моим приездом?
Unlike Medvedev, Putin confronted the factory owners.
Считаю, что вы сделали заложниками своих амбиций, непрофессионализма, а может быть просто и тривиальной жадности. Тысячи людей. Это абсолютно недопустимо. Если собственники договориться между собой не смогут, то единый комплекс все равно будет восстановлен. В том или в другом виде, то это будет сделано без вас.
He demanded the owners, including billionaire Oleg Deripaska, sign an undertaking to restart the factories.
Вы подписали этот договор? Да. Олег Владимирович подписал? Что я не вижу вашей подписи? Идите, подпишите. Идите. Куда договор?
Classic Putin.
and so Putin played the part of the tough anti-Western, anti-capitalist Soviet, all the while his country was surrendering even more to the global culture, himself becoming a piece of advertisement propaganda.
Мой лучший друг — это президент Путин. Мой лучший друг — это президент Путин. Мой лучший друг — это президент Путин. Мой лучший друг — это президент Путин.
Мой белый владыка, кто левый, тот на выход. Эти девочки просились, возьми любую из них на выбор. Считаем бюджет, сидя на столе. Пирамида души, всплеск, красивая Россия, встречай сына. Города говорят об одном, мы поставили новый рекорд. Над головой мой триколор, холоднокровных ни одного. Быть первыми — это наш рок, это мой круг, это мой дом. Все для него и свобода рекой нам под силу. Ты знаешь про любовь тебе одной. Мы с вами за него всей страной. Вы знали, он крутой супергерой. Сегодня я игрок, мой друг со мной. Идем плавно, он главный, значит будет все по плану. Ты знаешь, кто твой флагман. Ты знаешь, кто твой флагман. Мистер Президент, с нами наравне. Те, кто в зале здесь все.
Мой лучший друг — это президент Путин. Мой лучший друг — это президент Путин.
Русский продукт снова в цене. Лада седан, салют АвтоВАЗ. Мой лучший друг снова в игре. Мой лучший друг один из нас. Если страна это клуб, то на танцполе сегодня много людей. Нет фейс-контроля, здесь все равны. Все остальное решает диджей. Мой лучший друг встает за пульт. Рейтинг растет, качает страна. Девочки просто от него без ума. Мой лучший друг пока не женат. Работаем без перерыва от понедельника и до субботы. Скажи, кто твой лучший друг, и я сразу скажу,
ты
кто
знаешь
ты.
про любовь тебе одной.
But just before Putin fully and completely clenched power, as Russia was being sedated by foreign enterprise, amid voices stirring in the belly of their empire, Victor Pelevin, fresh off writing several earlier works of notable and impressionable substance, including a satirical, Kubrick-inspired take on the Soviet space program, stepped forth into further notoriety and delivered a most unusual comedy on the crumbling Cold War dichotomy, and his society's subsequent besiegement by streams of global capitalism. This novel, released in 1999, was known as Generation P in Russia, although it was published in the UK under the title Babylon, and originally marketed and published by Penguin as Homo sapiens. This would become the writer's best-known work, define a generation of Russians, and be sold worldwide. The book features a complex technological conspiracy, references to ancient Babylonian mythology, blatant criticism of consumerism, heavy incidental drug use and, of course, a virtual Boris Yeltsin. But what was it about these particular themes that caused such popularity and scrutiny? It may have had something to do with the humor and the scathing satire of consumerism. Or maybe it was something else, something more specific.
Шум. Ну почему столько шума? Эй, мужик, сегодня еще один праздник день.
Not very long ago, America introduced Pepsi to the Soviet Union.
Господи, что же такое? Что он делает-то? Ты посмотри на себя. Почему ты так одет?
And while it may be just a coincidence, a lot of refreshing changes have taken place ever since.
Эй, Лиза! Неужели у тебя нет нормальных друзей? Вот дети.
Pepsi, a generation ahead.
The book itself is a postmodernist tale of a kiosk clerk turned advertising spin doctor that skewers the Western market force and its permeation into modern Russia with a sarcastic and measured response, with Pelevin turning the hero, Babylon Tatarsky, into a conduit with which he can draw up humorous, yet oftentimes profound ads which mock not only capitalism, but the idea of advertising in general, with a special barb for Russian culture, or lack thereof included as well. Through the character of Tatarsky, the work explores the depths of the media, of consumerism, of material culture, and Pelevin doesn't just seem content to mock Russia. The West's long-lived love affair with vanity is inherent throughout, and comically so. After all, who can blame Pelevin, with such prime real estate for satire? The novel, although rooted in the American style of postmodernists such as Don DeLillo, Thomas Pynchon, and Kurt Vonnegut, has also a uniquely Russian feel. Pelevin conjures his world up in the Moscow of the 90s, and populates it with Chechens, mafiosos, New Age obsessees, oligarchs, a virtual Boris Yeltsin, and the occasional drug enthusiast. It takes on the form of a Bildungsroman as young Tatarsky, once a dreaming poet, begins to learn about the world around him, only to arrive at bizarre, and at once surreal, yet wholly incomplete conclusions. It explores themes ranging from westernization and media manipulation all the way to ancient Sumerian mysticism. Pelevin, with his unique literary voice, explores the world of Yeltsin's Russia not only through politics and the clash of ideas between Russia versus the West, but, more specifically, through the media and the market economy which became so prominent in this time throughout Eastern Europe and Russia. In this novel he uses the media, particularly advertising and television, along with consumerism and the advent of a Russian free market as a way to reveal the corruption, Russian identity crises, and democratic control by an inclusive oligarchy. And now, as Russia has shrugged its way into the 21st century amid a semi-return to hard-nosed policies under Vladimir Putin, it has become evident that this cathartic time during Yeltsin's tenure is just as important in the development of the modern Russia, as the era exhibited on the USSR under Gorbachev had been. Pelevin, during the time of its publication, was known as a recluse whose previous work seemed to be rooted in similar themes, these including a protagonist coming of age and a glimpse of modern Russian culture, technology, and ideology through the lens of ancient mythology. But here he turns his sights on the media, consumerism, and a reeking sense of pessimism alive in the Russia of Yeltsin. His hero, Babylon Tatarsky, has no future, and only a limited past involving his namesake, of which his father composed it from the title of Yevtushenko's famous poem Baby Yar, and Lenin. Although it has another connotation as well, mixing the name of the ancient city of Babylon with the racial identity of the Tartars, both of which, specifically the Mesopotamian mythology, seem to figure into Pelevin's narrative, whether as passing references or specific themes. This hero lives by the credo of "Thou lookest out always for number one," and seems to drift through the world around him, imbibing hallucinogens, thinking up advertising slogans, and somehow wending his way into the underground world of the media through an almost preternatural gift at copywriting. The world around the novel's protagonist is built out of conspiracies and con artists, the particular notion of this being revealed near the beginning, as Sergei Morkovin, a friend, explains the process by which someone who defaults on their loan will be reprimanded, saying, quote, "There's two endings. If the bank the guy owes money to is one of the mafia banks, then sometime or other he gets killed, and since there aren't any others, that's usually what happens." The character of Morkovin goes on to reveal that, if the guy's in the mafia himself, then the last loan gets shifted onto the state bank, and the guy declares himself bankrupt. This reveals the financial corruption apparent during the Yeltsin years, albeit humorously, and hints at levels of corruption existing everywhere, something the character of Tatarsky will learn firsthand when it comes to the world of advertising, the media, and the politicians whose public visages are constructed within it. The first aspect of this new onset of popular culture in Russia to be portrayed is consumerism, specifically advertising, revealed through Tatarsky's job as a copywriter at the draft podium. It is here that he becomes initiated into the world of the creative, a world of fake Rolexes, bizarre ad slogans, possible criminality, and inclusive mass manipulation of consumers. Through this world of copywriters, Pelevin is able to reveal troubling aspects of consumerist culture, and includes many a humorous advertisement idea from the minds of young Tatarsky and those of his firm. These hilarious examples include the Hamlet-inspired Just Be, Calvin Klein, a Nike commercial involving the Heaven's Gate cultists and their preferred sneakers, and the acidic Reebok send-up of Nike, "Do it yourself, motherfucker." In the novel, Pelevin has constructed here a sort of Russian countercultural hero in young Tatarsky, much in the mold of Thomas Pynchon's Oedipus, whose journey through the world of underground male cabals in his The Crying of Lot 49 is similar in its revealing of a stagnant pop culture and society amid a false renaissance obscuring a larger decline in morals, attitudes, and identities. Like that earlier work of postmodern fiction, there is indeed a conspiracy at the heart of the story, but also a tangible message being related to the reader outside of these distractions. The message here is clear, that a modern person living in the material world does not possess any inner nature. The only possible answer for it is to define itself via a combination of the material objects shown on television. This, from the rather sage advice given to the novel's hero via a disembodied Che Guevara channeled through a Ouija board, continues as the Argentinian Marxist medical doctor goes on to say that most objects advertised are associated with a specific personality type, character trait, propensity, or quality, and that the result is a completely convincing combination of these properties, propensities, and features, which is capable of producing the impression of a real personality. This coincides with the character of Voivova, whose pursuit of a Russian identity could also be seen as a pursuit of any identity, for in this modern, technological world where advertisements are being received by our brains at alarming rates, human beings are being transformed, conformed, turned from a specific person with a specific name into an individual who drives such and such a car, lives in such and such a house, wears such and such a type of clothes. It is this separation from the real world which is at the heart of the novel, as human beings are changed from Homo sapiens into Homo sapiens, mindless consumerist zombies zapping through channels trying to avoid commercials, or perhaps trying to avoid the programs and instead allow themselves to be brainwashed by the myriad of ads they subject themselves to willingly, as they let the static white noise of the television wash over them. The world of advertising gives way to the world of television, of marketing, of the media, a terrifying force of propaganda of the modern age which has hijacked our reality and in its place replaced it with products, ideologies, agendas, and entertainment. The specter of Che Guevara sums up our modern culture as thus: in the future, not a single work of art will be created for its own sake. The time is approaching when books and films will appear in which the dominant element of content will be a secret hymn of praise to Coca-Cola, and an attack on Pepsi-Cola, or vice versa. This idea is clearly satirized throughout, as Pelevin references both Pepsi and Coke to comic possibilities, at once even saying that, if you swallow Pepsi-Cola, you're absolutely certain to puke. Passages such as that one, in which Pelevin appears to be a part of the system with which he wrestles. After all, the title of this book comes from a generation reared on Pepsi, instead are devious satirical jabs at all of media, including modern literature, which is just as guilty of forwarding some sort of commercial agenda as film or television. Just as Che warns the novel's protagonist, our entertainment has ceased being art, and instead become a long form of advertisement, in which product placement, conformity, and pseudo-individualism have become the norm, and have subliminally entranced people so much so that they are often ignorant of the prevalence of these products in this playful deviation from reality we call popular entertainment.
Это Горбачев.
Горбачев?
Это из-за него у нас в экономике бардак.
Да благодаря ему у нас новые возможности.
Это из-за него у нас политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас свобода.
Полный хаос.
Перспективы.
Политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас есть писахат.
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева! За Горбачева!
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
Pelevin's novel, although more than a decade old, still seems urgent, particularly for non-Westerners who perhaps see our culture and its globalization as a frightening force of indoctrination ready to swallow up the entire world. The young Russians of the 90s experiencing this firsthand would have identified with the novel's hero, his lifestyle, and the work's themes. Before their eyes, the presidency of Yeltsin had stood back, exuding an air of welcome, while foreign conquerors under the guise of advertising tried to lay siege to the Slavic world, enticing Russians with blue jeans, sneakers, and sports cars. This seemed to dilute their national character, so much so that, among other factors including a family of oligarchic string pullers, to the people Yeltsin had become a total wreck, unable to move independently, think independently, or express himself intelligently. The character of Voivode, in his panicked plea for Tatarsky to use his creative powers for good, and come up with a Russian identity, says that, they think we're some kind of cultural scumbags, like we was animals with money, but what we are, is Russia. Makes you frightened to think of it? A great country. Sadly, this is true, and not just of Russia but of everywhere. Even in America people are party to this problem. Their reality, and the country's culture, revolves around money. Everywhere they can be seen, hypnotically circulating it around as they search for the newest electronic gadget, or conformist article of clothing that will allow them to join the herd. If this problem is endemic to the entirety of modern civilized society, then it is true what Pelevin says, that we've lost our roots for the time being because of all this crap that's going down. It is no shock that today most people will get their news and information from a television program, podcast, viral video, or internet post, instead of coming to their own, independent, and objectively researched conclusions. But all of this was already predicted within the pages of this novel, and sadly so, as it is dryly stated that, nowadays people find out what they think from the television. No discussion of Russia in the 90s should be without at least a mention of democracy, or its uneven advent at this time. Pelevin seems bitter about democracy, realizing that the oligarchs, men such as the late Boris Berezovsky, quote-unquote the Professor Moriarty of the 21st century, or Anatoly Chubai, businessman and CFR member, and media tycoon Vladimir Guzinsky will control the state through influence, bribery, and guile. The politicians, and the oligarchs, in the world of Homo sapiens are revealed to be rendered copies of the real things. They parade before a digitally inserted crowd, discuss Islam and foreign policies with Chechen warlords, and stumble drunkenly, all the while being merely a construct built from a computer. This gets down to the heart of Pelevin's satire, that our world exists as a simulacrum, or a composite of popular media and advertising. The character of Morkoven brilliantly sums it up as thus: by his very nature every politician is just a television broadcast. He continues, ceding that, even if we do sit a live human being in front of the camera, his speeches are going to be written by a team of speechwriters, his jackets are going to be chosen by a group of stylists, and his decisions are going to be taken by the Interbank Committee. Here is Pelevin telling us the truth, maybe through a bizarre and fictitious conspiracy, but the truth nonetheless, as even our representatives, our politicians, and especially those of Russia, have been prepared, pampered, put through the grind, and propped up so that the public views them in a certain artificial way. This sort of invective comic rhetoric may well be the reason why so many young Russians identified with Pelevin's writing. When they see a politician, a Yeltsin, or a Putin, or a Medvedev, they see just another corporate shill in a suit who will do the family of oligarchs' bidding no matter what the masses want. This is the reason why Pelevin can be seen by a generation of Russians raised on Pepsi as a reliable mediator, because within his bizarre schemes there lies essential truths about their world. They are being attacked by foreign investors, Western consumerism, and homegrown oligarchs hungry for more power and wealth. Although Putin has chased away many of the Yeltsin-era oligarchs, the Russia of Stalin is no more, and instead, especially so during the Yeltsin years, they are left with some sort of mutant variety of third-world quasi-democratic free-market existence. This unequal reproduction of democracy and capitalism is, for Russians, really just dressing something up as something it's not. This period, in which Russia's focus was distracted by the preliminary Chechen wars and a fractured political realm, whilst American influences began to permeate their society, could just as equally be called Russian Americanism. The ideas sounded nice, and kicked out in the manner of ads and television programs and from out of the mouths of politicians, seemed to be something progressive. But in truth this transformation had been one of Russian design. The oligarchic mafia still controlled politics, the economy, and the media, yet people fell under this trance and believed the lies. The novel's virtual rendering of Yeltsin, although amusing, really seems to speak to a larger issue, which is that the invented world which was being pulled over Russian eyes was not real in the strictest sense, it was a charade, a staged transformation. Some Russians maybe knew this, especially free thinkers such as Pelevin, who voices in another conversation between Tatarsky and a friend what seems to be his sarcastic gratitude to the newly synthetic Russian identity created during the Yeltsin years. Thank you for sometimes allowing me to live a parallel life. Without that the real one would be so disgusting. The Russian Federation has now become a player on the world stage. Bolstered in part by the boldness of Putin and the strength of its military power, it has entered this new age as a partially westernized titan in the fashion of Iran and China. This was not always the case though, as in the early parts of its transformative years under Boris Yeltsin, it looked as if it would slip into third world status and continue on in stagnation. The creeping inclusion of capitalism and a free market has changed it from the well-oiled socialist machine it had strived to be, into a keen amalgamation of secular ideas and Russian philosophy amid an influx of Western goods and influence. This philosophy, nihilistic, pessimistic, and rigidly cynical, yet promising, and stoic, is seen throughout Victor Pelevin's Homo sapiens, or Generation P. Even for a modern audience, the translation of Pelevin's acerbic satire is still cunningly cutting, especially in America, where, just as he predicted, novels, or other byproducts of a stagnant culture, are regularly churned out as meaningless bits of temporary consumption to distract the masses. Despite this contemporary appeal, Pelevin's Homo sapiens is a museum piece. It speaks of a specific time and place, one alien to most people living outside of urban Russia in the 90s, but still essential to anyone willing to accept its message. What is presented is none other than a sort of modern-day interpretation of Plato's allegory of the cave, in which the philosopher revealed that the world is but a projection through which our minds falsely accept a reality that is separate from the realm of nature. In it, Plato has Socrates explain a gathering of people who have lived chained to the wall and imprisoned in a cave all of their lives, facing a blank stone wall. The prisoners watched shadows projected on the wall from things passing in front of a flame behind them, and they begin to give names to these shadows. The shadows are as close as the people get to viewing reality. Socrates then explains how the philosopher is like a prisoner who is freed from the cave and comes to understand that the shadows on the wall do not make up reality at all, for he can perceive the true form of reality rather than the mere shadows seen by the ensnared prisoners. The novel's protagonist, Tatarsky, although a drug-addicted, possibly schizophrenic, unreliable narrator, discovers this truth throughout his journey. In the novel, the consumerist products, false media, and virtual politicians represent the shadows on the wall, to which we all have names for: Pepsi, popular culture, and Yeltsin. Tatarsky, and those of his clandestine advertising cabal, have been freed from the cave's deception, and are capable of seeing the world for what it really is. Despite these lofty theorizations, it is important to remember what the main character's co-worker and eventual subordinate, Farsikon, tells him near the end: don't go looking for symbolic significance in everything. You might regret it when you find it. The reader, if they look hard enough, could find much more within the folds of this novel, as it touches on ancient Sumerian mysticism, Russian late 20th century politics, the tumultuous relationship with the West, and indeed even the unsteady nature of reality. The core issues, though, seem to be the media, its portrayal of politicians, of products, of consumerism, its acceptance into Russian culture, and its fueling of Yeltsin's free market and the diluting, polluting, and convoluting effect of television. The novel uses the media, particularly advertising and television, along with consumerism and the advent of a Russian free market, as a way to reveal the corruption, Russian identity crises, and democratic control by an inclusive oligarchy, as well as the overall hypnotic nature of this time. A time when a distortion of the American dream came to Russia in the form of Mercedes, counterfeit watches, cheap vodka, even cheaper politicians, and ads that would make one's head spin. Overall, the Yeltsin years are reaffirmed as an era of social, economic, and political upheaval. Those younger generations of Russians, because of the almost surreal nature of this time, grabbed hold of Pelevin's narrative and embraced it amid this restless interval, using it as reason to question authority, specifically Yeltsin, a man whose political blunders included the entrance into the initial pair in the series of 3 Chechen wars, a seemingly aggressive and unquestionably politically jarring attack on his own parliament in '93, and the failed fiscal realization that fostered an extreme inflation which marred his country's fresh beginning. The onset of the Russian Federation ushered in a brief era of economic instability, self-centeredness, egos run rampant, and political dissension. In other words, it could have been called Russia's American period, which might explain why they seem to be reverting backwards in many aspects under Vladimir Putin, who represents at least a partial rejection of Western hegemony.
I have to interrupt right here and tell you that one of my visits, I won't name him, I don't want to embarrass him, but one of the heads of state that I met with on this visit, he gave me one while I was on the way. Told me the story about the two fellows in the Soviet Union who were walking down the street, and the one of them says, have we really achieved full communism? Is this it? Is this now full communism? The other one said, oh, hell no, things are going to get a lot worse.
It is important to remember that Russia is a sophisticated, historically grand nation whose military ambitions appear to be astonishing. Although they have risen from the ash of the Soviet Union, they are not to be underestimated and are capable of frightening destruction. But regardless of such dread, in the end one is reminded of the Tuborg man, a perfect stand-in for the ancient existence of Russia, who wipes the sweat from his brow as he is resting against a pastoral fence. He is halfway through his journey, contemplating some sort of junction in the road, much like the predicament Russia had faced while under Yeltsin. The question of whether to fully embrace Western capitalism and democracy or to retain a shadow, or perhaps more, of its former self gave definition to aspects of the Yeltsin years. But just as the character on the logo himself, Russia in the 90s often seemed trapped in endless wait for the satisfaction of their motherland's symbolic beer. Although true Muscovites would have preferred the smoothly refreshing taste of a cold bottle of Pepsi Cola.
Издалека долго течет река Волга, течет река, а мне 17 лет. Британский наш народ всегда с веслом в руке, с друзьями каждый год он ходит по реке. Мы взяли водки и в корму воткнули флаг, настроив лодке, не считая кучи пап. Течет река Темза, течет река, а нам по 20 лет. Мы лодочку свою покрасим в желтый цвет, приделаем трубу, зато ты и привет. Внезапно будет подниматься из глубин, и ты поймаешь Yellow Submarine. Издалека звонко течет Амазонка, течет река, а нам по 30 лет. Эх, выйти бы с утра на Волгу, на простор, там черная икра и девки на покор, там пиво светлое и темные леса. Мы поплывем с тобой назад в ЮССР. Издалека долго течет река Волга, течет река, а нам по 40 лет. Поднимем перископ, я встану у руля. Проникнем на восток, до самого Кремля. Пускай поймают и посадят нас в тюрьму. Check it up now. Зато увидим реку Колыму. Издалека где-то течет река зэков, течет река и всем по 10 лет. Течет река и всем по 20 лет. Течет река и всем по 30 лет. Течет река и всем по 40 лет.